When it comes to the worst monarchs in Spanish history, one name always rises to the top, and not in a good way. Historians, scholars, even royal biographers, every single one of them seems to agree. There has never been a more depraved, more vicious, or more sexually unhinged ruler to wear the Spanish crown than Ferdinand VII. But the truth about this king, it's even worse than what you've heard. All those stories about royal grace, noble bloodlines, and the sanctity of European monarchy, that's a carefully constructed lie, a facade meant to cover up something far more disturbing. Because Ferdinand didn't just rule Spain, he corrupted its very soul. He turned the royal palace into something closer to a haunted brothel than a seat of power. Before he became infamous as El Rey Felon, the felon King Ferdinand was already a figure of ridicule behind closed palace doors, physically misshapen, painfully awkward, and sexually dysfunctional to the point of humiliation. Even his mother-in-law once wrote that he wasn't truly a man. And this isn't just hearsay. We have multiple eyewitness accounts, royal physicians, foreign envoys, even the women involved themselves, describing in chilling detail the physical reality that would shape the fate of a kingdom. What you're about to hear isn't just a bizarre footnote in history. It's a full-blown tragedy, a horrifying, pathetic, and strangely intimate tale of power, fear, and a kind of sexual dysfunction that literally reshaped Spain. Let's begin with a wedding night in 1819, a night so infamous, the Vatican got involved. October 1819, the Royal Palace of Madrid. Inside a lavish chamber, a 16-year-old girl named Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony is trembling with fear. She's just been married off to the King of Spain. Raised in a convent, this sheltered teenager doesn't even know how babies are made. She thinks they were delivered by storks. No one explained anything. Her German attendants, too embarrassed to tell her the truth, simply dressed her in white, placed a rosary in her hands, and left her waiting for a man twice her age. And then the door creaks open. This isn't the prince from fairy tales. Ferdinand VII is 35. He's overweight, has gout, bulging lips, and a disturbing glint in his eye. But none of that is what truly terrifies the young queen. Because Ferdinand suffers from an extremely rare and grotesque medical condition called macrogenitosomia. In simple terms, his genitals were monstrously oversized, but not in the way most people might imagine. French writer Prosper Mérimée, who later interviewed courtiers who were present, described it as thin as a taper at the base, as thick as a fist at the end, and as long as a billiard cue. Now imagine being that innocent 16-year-old girl, barely educated about her own body, confronted with that. She didn't scream. She ran, bolted out of the bed like her life depended on it. But Ferdinand, already drunk and determined, gave chase. Picture this, a bloated, 35-year-old king stumbling around the room, huffing and puffing, trying to catch his teenage bride, who's literally fleeing in terror. She was fast. He wasn't. Furious at her rejection, Ferdinand did something unthinkable. He stormed out of the bedroom completely naked, his deformity on full display, and began screaming at the queen's attendants. He called them animals, accused them of sabotaging the wedding, and demanded they prepare the queen for him within 15 minutes. These poor women, her attendants, her sister-in-law, were now expected to explain to this terrified girl what was about to happen to her. Whatever they said only made it worse. When Ferdinand returned, ready to try again, he was greeted by a foul stench that no royal perfume could mask. In her terror, Maria Josepha had lost control of her bowels. The king found his bed soiled with human waste. He was repulsed. He shouted, "Queens do not smell of civet," and then stormed out again. He wouldn't touch her for over a week. But this wasn't the end of her ordeal. It was just the beginning. To really understand why this wedding night went so horrifically wrong, we have to look deeper into what Ferdinand was hiding beneath those royal robes. Warning: it gets graphic. Multiple physicians examined the king over the years and left behind written reports. One doctor, José María de la Fuente, wrote, "His Majesty possesses a member of such extraordinary dimensions that normal conjugal relations are rendered impossible without causing injury to his partner. It wasn't just the size, it was the shape. Like a medieval torture device, thin at the base, enormous at the tip. A deformity that had plagued him since his first marriage. Let's go back to 1802. Ferdinand, then 18, marries his cousin, Maria Antonia of Naples. Their wedding night, a disaster. According to Maria Antonia's own letters, Ferdinand just stood there, gawking at her, awkwardly groping her chest. He had no idea what to do. No one had taught him, and his body didn't help. For 11 months, they tried and failed to consummate the marriage. Ferdinand would get aroused, attempt intercourse, and then nothing. He simply couldn't make it work. It was like trying to solve a puzzle with broken pieces. Maria Antonia's mother, Queen Maria Carolina, grew desperate. She wrote letter after letter pleading for help. "My daughter weeps nightly," she wrote. "The prince feels nothing. There is no pleasure, no effect. It is an extraordinary and unfortunate situation." Eventually, the royal confessor had to intervene. Yes, a Catholic priest had to sit the future king down and explain step by step how sex worked. The humiliation didn't stay secret. It spread through European courts like wildfire. The Spanish heir was a sexual incompetent, a freak. When Ferdinand finally figured it out nearly a year later, the results were catastrophic. Maria Antonia suffered to miscarriages most likely due to internal injuries and died at age 21. Her young body, literally broken by her husband. But instead of being traumatized, Ferdinand became obsessed. The death of Maria Antonia in 1806 ended the embarrassment of their unconsummated marriage. But it also unlocked something far darker inside Ferdinand. The prince who once couldn't perform became a king who couldn't stop. By 1814, after Napoleon's defeat, Ferdinand returned to power. Now 30, sexually frustrated, and intoxicated by absolute authority, he unleashed a reign of debauchery that would make even Caligula blush. Every night, he would sneak out of the palace under a cloak, heading for the most notorious brothel in Madrid. It was run by a madam named Pepa la Malaguena. So infamous was her establishment that decent citizens crossed the street just to avoid passing it. And Ferdinand didn't go alone. He brought with him a posse of young aristocrats equally corrupt and degenerate. Together, they turned Madrid's red light district into their personal playground. But this wasn't just about sex. Ferdinand had something to prove. He was proud of his deformity, the same thing that had once shamed him. So proud, in fact, that he turned it into a party trick. Multiple eyewitnesses described the same stomach-turning scene. The King of Spain, deep in his cups, surrounded by noble degenerates, would drop his pants and challenge his companions to a contest of manhood. Literally, they'd line up, expose themselves, and compare sizes. Ferdinand always won. Of course he did. They even gave him a nickname, El Bien Dotado, the well-endowed one. He strutted around these brothels like a peacock, showing off the very thing that had ruined to royal marriages. But showing off wasn't enough. Ferdinand had developed a dark and disturbing fetish, something that reveals the full depth of his twisted desires. According to Count José María de Villalobos, who recorded Ferdinand's own words, the king once boasted, "They leave my bed certain that no other man can give them the pleasure I gave them." And do you know what I enjoy most after possessing them? Collecting the rags stained with the proof of their maidenhood? Yes, you heard that right. The King of Spain collected blood-stained sheets trophies from the virgins he deflowered. These weren't relics of some outdated custom. This was personal, obsessive. He kept them like other men kept paintings or rare books. While his second wife was busy founding the Museo del Prado, Ferdinand was building his own collection, one of pain, shame, and violence. And it wasn't limited to the women of Pepa's brothel. Wherever he traveled, Ferdinand left a trail of destruction. In Aragon, it was a widow. In Sedan, a peasant girl. Back in the palace, it was maids and servants, women who had no choice, no protection, no escape. Each encounter added a new cloth to his twisted archive. Each rag, another woman turned into a souvenir. All the while, Spain itself was collapsing, the American colonies gone. Reformers executed, the economy ruined. While his people starved and revolted, Ferdinand partied. He wasn't just indifferent, he was proud of his excesses. And still, this man who couldn't control his lust kept looking for wives. In 1816, desperate for an heir, he married his own niece. Yes, niece, Maria Isabel of Braganza, a 19-year-old Portuguese princess. She was young, plain, and politically convenient. Madrid's gossips weren't kind. They whispered a cruel rhyme about her. Fia, pobre, y portuguesa, chapate esse, ugly, poor, and Portuguese suck on that. But Maria Isabel had something Ferdinand didn't: class, dignity. While he continued his nightly visits to brothels, she focused on elevating the court. She championed the arts, founded institutions, and quietly tried to bring a bit of grace to a court drowning in vice. Still, to Ferdinand, she was just a womb, a vessel. And in 1818, she became pregnant. This is where Ferdinand's story shifts from grotesque to tragic. Maria Isabel went into labor, and immediately, something was wrong. The baby was breech, the queen was in agony. The royal doctors had to make an impossible decision: save the mother, or save the child. Ferdinand didn't hesitate. Save the child, he ordered. Cut her, if you must. 12 witnesses were in the room that day. All gave the same account. The surgeons began an emergency cesarean. This was 1818, no proper anesthesia, just alcohol and crude painkillers. They believed Maria Isabel was unconscious. She wasn't. Halfway through, her eyes flew open, and she screamed a scream that echoed through the palace. She was awake as they cut her open, awake as they tore her body apart for a baby that had already died. Maria Isabel bled out on the operating table. She was just 21. Some blamed Ferdinand's grotesque anatomy for the complications. Others pointed to his syphilis gift from all those brothel nights as the likely cause of the miscarriage. But Ferdinand felt nothing, no grief, no guilt. Within the year, he was shopping for another wife. If Maria Isabel's death was a tragedy, what happened to Ferdinand's third wife was something much darker. That wife, the same young woman who had soiled herself in fear on their wedding night, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. After the disaster of their first night together, Ferdinand left her alone for a week. But eventually, he returned, and this time, she fought back. Raised by nuns to be obedient and silent, Maria Josepha became a wildcat when faced with her husband. She scratched, she bit, and at one point, she kicked Ferdinand so hard in the groin that the king howled in pain and fled from the room. But how long can a teenager resist a king? Ferdinand changed tactics. Instead of force, he tried patience. Every night, he entered her chamber. Every night, she prayed the rosary, hoping God would protect her. And every night, he failed. Maria Josepha had a secret weapon: ignorance. She genuinely didn't understand what sex was. She believed that any physical act between man and woman outside of divine will was sin. So, when Ferdinand tried to explain how babies were made, she called him a liar. God would never use such a disgusting act to create life, she said. You're testing my virtue with these lies. Weeks turned into months. The king who once bragged about deflowering virgins couldn't even bed his own wife. The court began to whisper. Foreign diplomats wrote back to their governments, embarrassed to report what they'd heard. Eventually, Ferdinand played his last card. He wrote to the Pope. Pope Pius VII, already in his 70s and a survivor of Napoleon, must have stared at Ferdinand's letter in disbelief. The defender of the faith, the King of Spain, was asking the Holy Father to convince his teenage bride to have sex with him, and the Pope obliged. The reply, still kept in Vatican archives, is a master class in polite pressure. The Pope gently explained that marital relations weren't just allowed, they were required by God. Refusing to consummate the marriage was, essentially, refusing divine will. Maria Josepha finally agreed, but she had conditions. Before each encounter, she would pray the entire rosary. During the act, she would keep her eyes shut, and she would picture the Virgin Mary to stay spiritually pure. Now imagine Ferdinand, Monarch of Spain, feared by millions, lying next to his teenage wife while she whispers Hail Mary, full of grace under her breath, eyes closed, barely moving. By every account, it was the least erotic real marriage in history. 10 years of this, 10 years of rosary accompanied, mechanical sex. 10 years without a single child. When Maria Josepha died at 25 officially of fever, the entire court exhaled in relief. Ferdinand had failed again. 3 wives, 2 dead, 0 heirs, but the king wasn't done. At 45, diseased, disgraced, and desperate, he tried one last time. Enter Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. Just 23 years old, fresh from Naples, and believe it or not, Ferdinand's own niece, again. Yes, his niece, because apparently, royal bloodlines weren't twisted enough already. Maria Cristina was different. She wasn't terrified of Ferdinand. She wasn't naive like Maria Josepha, or tragically refined like Maria Isabel. She was calculating. She knew what marrying the King of Spain could mean for her and for her family. If she could give him an heir, everything could change. And in 1830, that's exactly what she did. Against all odds, despite Ferdinand's ruined body, rotten gums, and failing health, Maria Cristina got pregnant. 9 months later, she gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. Ferdinand was overjoyed. He had his heir. Well, kind of. You see, Spain had a little law called the Salic Law, an old Bourbon tradition that said only males could inherit the throne. So technically, Isabella wasn't in line for the crown. But Ferdinand, drunk on hope and desperate to secure his legacy, changed the law. Just like that, female succession was suddenly allowed. The nobles were stunned, the clergy outraged. But Ferdinand didn't care. Isabella would rule, no matter what. This decision sparked one of the bloodiest civil wars in Spanish history, the Carlist Wars. Supporters of Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, saw Isabella's ascension as a betrayal of tradition. They declared him the rightful king and marched to war. Spain, already limping from Ferdinand's disastrous rule, now descended into chaos. And Ferdinand, he kept spiraling. By this point, his body was failing. The syphilis had spread, his teeth fell out. His hair came off in clumps. His breath reportedly smelled so foul that courtiers fainted if they got too close. His legs swelled to the size of tree trunks. Some accounts suggest maggots had started to form in his open sores. He couldn't walk. He couldn't ride. He could barely even speak, but somehow, he clung to power. The last months of his life were a grotesque parade of denial. Carried from room to room, covered in perfumes and powder, he insisted on receiving foreign dignitaries even as his body rotted beneath his robes. Witnesses wrote that his fingers turned black from gangrene. His gums oozed pus. His body temperature fluctuated wildly. He screamed at servants, cursed at doctors, and accused everyone of plotting to steal his throne. At night, he cried out for his mother. He begged for his dead wives. And most hauntingly, he whispered to someone no one else could see, a child. Some say it was his unborn son, the one he never had. Others say it was a hallucination, brought on by disease and regret. But every night, Ferdinand wept and whispered, "Forgive me. Please forgive me." On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII finally died. He was 49 years old. Spain rejoiced. His corpse was so bloated and disfigured that the embalmers had to sew his mouth shut to give the appearance of peace. But it was all an illusion. He left behind a broken nation, a traumatized court, and a 2-year-old girl who would be crowned Queen Isabella, the second child monarch at the center of a nation already tearing itself apart. As for Maria Cristina, the young widow wasted no time. Within months, she secretly married her bodyguard, a handsome, low-born man named Agustin Munoz. She kept the marriage a secret for years, fearing backlash, but it didn't stop her from having 8 children with him. Yes, 8. While Ferdinand had destroyed 3 wives, just trying to produce 1 heir, Maria Cristina got on with her life like the past never happened. It's as if Spain itself wanted to forget Ferdinand, and it almost did. But here's the question: how did it come to this? How did a nation that once ruled the seas and commanded empires end up with a king whose name became a punchline in foreign courts? It wasn't just Ferdinand's cruelty or corruption. Those were symptoms. The real disease was deeper: decay from within. Ferdinand was born into a system that rewarded obedience over intelligence, blood over merit, and brutality over compassion. From childhood, he learned that power came not from love, but from fear. That women were tools, that enemies were to be crushed, not debated. He wasn't an anomaly, he was the natural outcome of a dynasty obsessed with purity and control. A dynasty so terrified of change that it produced a king who would rather destroy his wives than examine himself. Even after death, his legacy lingered like a bad smell. The Carlist Wars dragged on for decades. Isabella II would face constant uprisings, assassination attempts, and political instability. By the time she was exiled in 1868, Spain had cycled through 5 constitutions and 2 civil wars. All because one man couldn't stop himself. There's a bitter irony in the final image we have of Ferdinand VII. In the grand portrait painted just months before his death, he's dressed in golden robes, crowned with laurel leaves, and surrounded by symbols of power: eagles, swords, and scepters. He looks every inch the monarch, but look closer, and you'll see it: the swollen hands, the blotchy skin, the distant, glassy eyes. The artist couldn't hide it all, because beneath the crown, beneath the velvet, and beneath the pretense was a corpse waiting to collapse. A man who ruled through terror, died in agony, and left nothing behind but pain. Now, let us step back for a moment and talk about something that might seem simple, but in Ferdinand's case, was a complete disaster: daily life at court. Most monarchs tried to maintain some level of decorum. Even the most eccentric kings and queens, Louis XIV with his golden slippers, or Catherine the Great with her elaborate rituals, understood that the royal court was not just a home. It was a symbol, a message, a tool of power. But in Ferdinand VII Spain, the court was more like a rotting theater. The costumes were still there, the grand chandeliers still glittered. But behind the curtains, it smelled of mold, sickness, and fear. Ferdinand's palace became a place where reality warped. The king's day often began not with meetings or councils, but with hours of superstition and paranoia. He would consult priests, mystics, and even self-proclaimed miracle workers. He believed his ailments were caused by curses or demonic influences, not his own lifestyle or decisions. His courtiers learned quickly: tell the king what he wanted to hear, or face ruin. Entire ministries were appointed based on flattery, not skill. If someone made a joke he didn't like or even wore a color he found unpleasant, they could be dismissed, imprisoned, or worse. Food was another battleground of delusion. Ferdinand, despite his rotting gums and bloated body, insisted on lavish meals, endless stews, meat soaked in cream and wine, rich desserts dripping with honey, and yet, he could barely eat. His mouth was so ulcerated that every bite was agony. But still, he sat there, drooling, chewing slowly, refusing to acknowledge the absurdity. Servants were required to pretend nothing was wrong, and that was the essence of Ferdinand's court: pretend. Pretend the king was wise, pretend the country wasn't bankrupt, pretend the king's body wasn't literally decaying in front of them. Some accounts even say that mirrors were removed from parts of the palace so that Ferdinand wouldn't have to see what he'd become. But amid all the madness, there were still people trying to keep the country afloat. One of them was Francisco C. Bermudez, a prime minister who briefly tried to reform the government and reduce censorship. He was intelligent, capable, and brave enough to push back at least a little. Naturally, Ferdinand hated him. Bermudez was ousted within months, replaced by more compliant lackeys. Reforms were rolled back, censorship returned with a vengeance, and Spain kept sinking deeper into the mud. Cultural life, too, was strangled. Books were banned, plays were censored. Artists either fled the country or produced hollow portraits of saints and monarchs safe, dull, and lifeless. Spain, once a beacon of literature and art, had become a museum of fear. And while Ferdinand's personal failures were shocking, they weren't unique. All across Europe, royal courts were showing signs of terminal decay. The old system's divine right, rigid hierarchy, inherited power were starting to crumble. In France, the revolution had already taken heads. In England, Parliament was growing stronger. In Prussia and Austria, reformers were whispering in the halls. But in Spain, Ferdinand clung to the past with both fists. Even as trains were being invented, newspapers spreading across continents, and science transforming daily life, Ferdinand still ruled like a medieval tyrant, surrounded by yes-men and superstition. And that brings us to one of the most disturbing elements of his reign, the treatment of women at court. We've already discussed his wives, but Ferdinand's abuse of power over women extended far beyond marriage. Servants, ladies-in-waiting, even noble women, all were subject to his whims. There are chilling reports of young women being brought to the palace for auditions, supposedly to serve in court, but, in reality, chosen based on looks and family connections. Some were barely teenagers. Consent wasn't part of the equation. Saying no to the king could mean exile for your family or worse. One surviving letter from a courtier describes how a girl he knew was favored by the king. She was just 15. Her family considered it an honor. But afterward, she was never the same, withdrawn, pale, terrified of being alone. Her family sent her to a convent, quietly, so the story wouldn't spread. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern, and a deeply protected one. No one dared accuse the king directly. Even whispers could be punished. And for those who did try to speak out, the Inquisition was still around, tamed. Yes, but still useful when someone needed to disappear. It's no wonder that, after Ferdinand's death, dozens of women left the court overnight, fleeing with secrets they never spoke aloud. And yet, for all his abuse and decay, Ferdinand saw himself as a defender of morality. He cracked down on indecent art. He banned novels deemed too French. He railed against women wearing clothing that showed their ankles. Yes, ankles. This wasn't just hypocrisy. It was projection. Ferdinand's inner rot spilled outward, poisoning the world around him while he clung to a fantasy of righteousness. But it gets worse, because Ferdinand didn't just hurt the people closest to him, he also crushed the very idea of a Spanish identity. Before his reign, Spain was already struggling to hold onto its empire. Colonies in the Americas were starting to rebel. Independence movements were brewing in Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela. And what did Ferdinand do? Nothing. Well, worse than nothing. When he was first restored to power in 1814, he rejected a liberal constitution that could have modernized the country. He ignored the warnings of his generals. He taxed the colonies harshly and refused to give them representation. The result: between 1810 and 1830, Spain lost almost all of its colonies in Latin America. A global empire vanished in just 2 decades, and Ferdinand barely noticed. While Bolivar was fighting for freedom, Ferdinand was worrying about his dinner menu and his mistress list. And even as Spain's power collapsed, he still claimed divine right. Still believed he was chosen by God. That's what makes his story so tragic. Not just the horror but the waste. Spain could have been so much more. It had the mines, the culture, the geography, the resources. But Ferdinand's reign strangled innovation and drowned hope in bureaucracy and blood. When he died, the world didn't just lose a king. It lost a chance at renewal. Because for a brief moment after the Napoleonic Wars, with the monarchy restored and Europe reshaping, Spain had a shot at reinvention. But Ferdinand chose fear over progress, and in doing so, he dragged an entire nation into the grave with him. As Spain was falling apart piece by piece, Ferdinand's own body was decaying right alongside it. By the late 1820s, his physical condition had become impossible to hide. The man was falling apart literally. His legs were so swollen that he couldn't walk without help. His gums were black, his breath reportedly smelled like something rotting in the sun, and he suffered from intense chronic constipation. Doctors tried everything: leeches, enemas, opium, purgatives, but nothing worked. His body was shutting down. Some described it as though his organs were liquefying inside him. The irony is cruel. The man who had clung so desperately to absolute control couldn't even control his own digestion. Every meal was a risk, every movement a torment. His courtiers could hear him groaning from behind thick velvet curtains, and yet he refused to let go of power. Even as he was wasting away, Ferdinand remained obsessed with succession, legacy, and the idea of being remembered as a true Catholic king. His fourth wife, Maria Cristina of the two Sicilies, was much younger than him and, to everyone's surprise, she got pregnant. This was a miracle and a political disaster, because for centuries, Spain had followed a strict Salic law: only men could inherit the throne. But Ferdinand had no surviving sons, only this unborn child. So, with one final grasp at power, he issued the pragmatic sanction, a decree that overturned Salic law and allowed a woman to become queen. His brothers, especially Carlos, were furious. Carlos believed he was next in line. The conservatives, the church, and the rural nobility backed him. And suddenly, Spain was on the edge of civil war again. Ferdinand, from his deathbed, insisted his daughter would be queen. He clung to that idea as tightly as he clung to life itself. When Isabella II was finally born, he wept not from joy, but from fear. He knew what was coming. The moment he died, all hell would break loose. And he was right. Ferdinand's final days were gruesome. His feet turned black from lack of circulation. Ulcers covered his legs. His skin broke open in sores. Some sources say his attendants had to pack his rotting flesh with herbs and perfumes, just to mask the smell. He drifted in and out of consciousness, barely able to speak. Priests visited constantly. Last rites were administered multiple times. But the king clung to life for weeks, his body refusing to die, even as it completely failed him. One priest described the scene as a death not of a man, but of a haunted shell, and when he finally passed on September 29, 1833, few wept. In fact, many people breathed a sigh of relief, but the chaos was just beginning. With Ferdinand gone, Spain plunged into what became known as the Carlist Wars, a brutal series of civil conflicts that would scar the country for generations. On one side, supporters of Isabella II, a baby queen propped up by moderates and liberals who believed in constitutional monarchy. On the other, Don Carlos, Ferdinand's brother, backed by absolutists, traditionalists, and rural clergy who saw Isabella as a threat to the natural order. It wasn't just about a crown, it was about the soul of Spain. Would the country embrace the future or cling to a decaying past? Unfortunately, the war was long, bloody, and inconclusive, and the shadow of Ferdinand's rule hung over everything. His refusal to reform, his obsession with power, and his short-sighted decrees had left Spain fragile both politically and spiritually. Even as railroads were being built and revolutions rocked other nations, Spain was stuck fighting a war rooted in the ghost of a man who had refused to evolve. But what happened to the people closest to Ferdinand? Let's start with Maria Cristina, his widow. After Ferdinand's death, she served as regent for her daughter. But she quickly learned that running Spain without her husband wasn't any easier. She faced assassination attempts, court intrigue, and relentless attacks from the Carlists. Eventually, she remarried in secret, something that, once revealed, sparked scandal. The once respected queen regent was forced into exile, fleeing Spain under a cloud of suspicion. As for Isabella II, her reign was complicated. She was crowned at just 3 years old, and spent her childhood being used as a pawn by various factions. Her adult reign was filled with political instability, personal scandals, and eventually, exile. And what about Carlos, the brother? He launched a full rebellion, tried to seize the throne multiple times, and spent much of his life in exile or plotting from afar. The Carlist movement he inspired would live on for decades, long after his own death. So Ferdinand's death didn't bring peace, it only spread the rot further. What's perhaps most chilling is how Ferdinand has been remembered or forgotten. In most European histories, he barely gets a mention. Overshadowed by Napoleon, ignored in favor of revolutions, he's often a footnote. But in Spain, his legacy is far more sinister. Even today, some call him El Rey Felon, the criminal king, that title ain't about personal crimes, though he committed plenty. It's about betrayal. Ferdinand betrayed the people who believed in him. The liberals who hoped for progress, the conservatives who thought he'd protect tradition. Even the church, which he weaponized and then abandoned. He stood for nothing but his own comfort, and in doing so, he robbed Spain of its dignity, its potential, and much of its global standing. It's no wonder that even royalists today rarely speak of him. There are no grand monuments, no holidays in his name, just a trail of pain and missed opportunities. And maybe that's the most fitting punishment of all. For a man who craved legacy, power, and control, he left behind only decay. So what do we make of Ferdinand VII? Here was a man born into privilege, surrounded by splendor, yet consumed by paranoia and weakness. A man who, at multiple turning points in history, had the chance to steer Spain toward stability, reform, and even greatness, but instead chose fear, vengeance, and stagnation every single time. And the irony, he wasn't a monster, not in the traditional sense. He didn't wage endless foreign wars like Napoleon. He didn't orchestrate mass purges like Stalin. He wasn't a strategic genius, nor a charismatic tyrant. He was just selfish, small, insecure, obsessed with the throne, but clueless about how to wield power for the good of his people. He ruled with cruelty, yes, but more out of cowardice than malice. And that makes him all the more dangerous, because history isn't just shaped by villains with grand visions. Sometimes, it's shaped by weak men in powerful positions, people who are too scared to change, too proud to ask for help, too insecure to allow others to shine. Ferdinand's Spain didn't fall because of some foreign invasion or natural disaster. It fell from within. Rotten leadership, fear-driven decisions, a refusal to evolve, and above all, a belief that controlling people is the same as leading them. By the time Ferdinand died, Spain had lost most of its empire, its economy was in shambles, and its political system was broken beyond repair. The once mighty kingdom that had ruled oceans and empires was now a second-rate European state, fractured, disillusioned, and spiraling toward decades of conflict. All because one man couldn't let go of the past. And yet, his story holds a valuable lesson. In an age where leaders around the world still cling to power, rewrite laws to suit themselves, and silence dissent under the guise of patriotism or faith, we'd be wise to remember Ferdinand. Because authoritarianism doesn't always arrive with tanks and uniforms. Sometimes it creeps in behind royal curtains. Sometimes it wears the crown of a pious king. Sometimes it speaks the language of tradition while quietly strangling progress. It asks for your obedience, then your silence, then your soul. But let's return, one last time, to that decaying royal body. As Ferdinand's flesh literally rotted away, his court did everything they could to maintain the illusion of control. They dressed him in fine silks, perfumed the air around him, painted a face of dignity onto a collapsing corpse. It was grotesque, it was tragic, and it was Spain, in miniature, a kingdom once glorious, now crumbling, desperately clinging to outdated rituals, hoping no one would notice the smell. In the end, Ferdinand VII didn't just rot alone. He dragged an entire empire down with him, and that, perhaps, is his real legacy. Not as a builder, not as a liberator, not even as a true tyrant, but as a cautionary tale, a reminder that decay starts at the top and spreads quietly until it consumes everything. So the next time you hear the name Ferdinand and the Seventh, don't picture a mighty king on horseback or a visionary ruler in his palace. Picture a man lying in silken sheets, groaning in pain, his body riddled with sores, his courtiers pretending everything was fine, and the kingdom he swore to protect slipping away outside the window. That's the true face of absolute power, not glory, not strength, but rot. Let's share, connect, and explore the stories that have shaped our world. If this video helped you see history in a new light, with more depth, understanding, or simply spark new questions, don't forget to subscribe to Legacy of Ages. History is never just the past, it's always part of our present. Thanks for following and see you in my next post. Have a nice day.